All right, so when we left off last week, um, we had talked a little bit about how settling next to the rivers is going to be very important, and how the groups of people we talk about are all river civilizations, meaning that they're going to use their rivers pretty much in the same way, regardless of where they actually live. Okay, so it doesn't matter if we're talking about the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Aryans, whatever group it is, if they settled next to a river, odds are they used it for these 7 things. Okay, so these 7 things are going to pop up again throughout the year. So obviously, if you're going to settle next to a river, you now have a fresh water source and a food source. You can fish in it, you can hunt the animals that come to it for water. Trade and transportation. It's obviously a lot easier to travel from place to place using the river currents. You're more likely to go more places since you don't have to walk there. And you're going to be able to trade with the different groups of people that you encounter. With pottery and mud bricks, both of those things are going to be made from the clay and the mud from the sides of the riverbanks. And then lastly, irrigation, being able to water the crops that you plant throughout the year. We talked about how this part of the world doesn't necessarily get a lot of rain, so you still have to be able to water those crops once they're in the ground. So, first group of people that we're going to talk about is going to be a group called the Sumerians. And they're going to settle between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 3000 BC. So roughly about 500 years before the Egyptians built the pyramids. But they call this land Mesopotamia. It literally translates into land between two rivers. And these two rivers, like we already kind of talked about, make up what we call the Fertile Crescent. You include the Nile River in there, it kind of makes a C shape or a crescent shape, and the land in this area or around these rivers is going to be very fertile due to that flooding. All right, now our first group of people that are going to settle here in Mesopotamia are going to be called the Sumerians. We call them the Sumerians because when they lived in that area, it was referred to as Sumer. But it was made up of a bunch of tiny little city-states. As more and more people stopped hunting and gathering for survival and started living together in groups and farming, they start making up these little villages. And as more and more people didn't have to hunt and gather all day to survive, they were able to start developing their societies or developing their civilizations. Since not every person had to go out and hunt food anymore, and people could farm in one place, they had more time to do other things. So as they start building homes and trying to figure out how they're going to govern themselves and kind of make their civilization, all these city-states start to form. A city-state is simply their main village, the small farmland that would be around it, and these smaller villages that would be around it. But each one is kind of ruled like its own little mini country. Here's a map of what ancient Mesopotamia would have looked like with the different city-states. So originally, all these different villages or city-states were independent of one another. Each one had their own ziggurat, which we'll talk about later.
Dear Tim and Moby, who were the Sumerians? Sumer was one of the earliest societies to develop agriculture. That's the cultivation of food and other uses. Before agriculture, hunter-gatherers depended on the natural world to provide for them. But farming gave people a steady way to produce food. In Sumer, irrigation let farmers produce more food than they could eat themselves. As agricultural technology improved, the excess of food grew even larger. That allowed Sumer people to make their living in ways other than farming. People began to specialize in pot making, metalworking, building, baking, weaving, and sculpting. That's called division of labor. It's the basis of any advanced civilization. It lets people concentrate on something other than where their next meal is coming from. And that leads to the rise of cities. Sumerian city-states originally grew around simple temples. These temple structures later expanded into massive ziggurats, which were pyramids made of terraces linked by ramps and stairs. Well, there are about a dozen independent Sumerian city-states. They shared a common language and culture, but they weren't united under a single government or ruler. Each city-state worshipped its own god or goddess, who they believed actually lived inside the ziggurat. Each city-state was ruled by a king-like figure called an ensi, who doubled as the high priest. Ensis led the military, acted as judges, presided over religious ceremonies, and kept an eye on trade. Well, the reason we know so much about the Sumerians was that they were among the first people to develop a written language. Writing came about as a way to keep a record of their trading with other city-states and cultures. At first, they kept records using pieces of clay as tokens. These gradually developed into pictures and symbols that represented specific objects. By around 3100 BCE, the symbols had turned into a whole system of wedge-shaped marks and lines called cuneiform. But writing wasn't their only bright idea. The Sumerians also codified the first system of written laws and a system of government to enforce them. Bronze was another major development. The Sumerians mixed tin and copper to make tools and weapons out of this sturdy metal. The Sumerians also came up with a number system based on 60. They were the ones who divided the hour into 60 minutes, and the circle into 360 degrees. We still do that today. They even invented the first wheeled vehicle, which meant that wagons could be used to carry loads for long distances. Well, neighboring groups eventually conquered them and absorbed a lot of Sumerian culture. Much of that culture was passed down to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and eventually on to us.